In my sophomore year of college, I moved into a small, old apartment just off campus. It was cheap, run down, and smelled faintly of mildew, but it had a charm I couldn't resist. The only catch: I had to share it with a guy named Tom. When I met him, he seemed quiet, maybe a little distant, but I figured he was just reserved. The first night, Tom barely spoke. Instead, he spent hours in his room with the door closed, a faint humming coming from within. It was odd, but I shrugged it off. People had their quirks. But things started to get weirder. Every morning, I'd wake to find things in my room shifted. A chair moved across the room, my books scattered on the floor, the closet door left open when I distinctly remembered closing it. When I asked Tom if he'd been in my room, he denied it, looking almost offended. "You should keep it locked," he muttered before shutting himself back in his room. One night, I woke up to a strange sound, like something scratching at my door. I tried to ignore it, but it grew louder and more frantic. I turned on the light and opened the door, expecting maybe a rat. But it was Tom. He was crouched on the floor, his fingers scratching at the wood, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Tom?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer. He just kept scratching, mumbling something I couldn't make out. After what felt like an eternity, he got up, his gaze finally meeting mine. His eyes were dark and hollow. "You should keep your door locked," he repeated, then turned and walked away, leaving scratch marks down the length of my door. The next day I confronted him, but he acted like he didn't remember a thing. That night I locked my door, but around midnight I heard the scratching again. I froze in my bed, listening as it grew louder and more desperate. I held my breath, hoping it would stop. But then I heard Tom's voice, barely a whisper through the door. "They're coming. They're coming for you." The scratching stopped. I never saw Tom again after that night. He just disappeared, leaving behind only his empty room and those scratch marks on my door. It was Alex's first night in the old, creaky apartment he'd found near his new office. The landlord had told him he'd have a roommate, Ben, who kept to himself and worked night shifts. Alex didn't mind, he liked the peace. The first strange incident happened the very night Alex moved in. Just after midnight, as he was getting ready for bed, he heard footsteps outside his room, slow and heavy. He assumed it was Ben coming home late, but something felt off. The steps stopped right outside his door, lingering there in an eerie silence. Alex waited, but no knock came. Finally, he gathered the courage to open the door, but the hallway was empty. The next day, Alex brought it up with Ben when he finally met him over coffee in the kitchen. "Did you come back late last night?" Alex asked. Ben looked confused. "I wasn't home. I was at work the whole night." Unsettled, Alex brushed it off as a strange coincidence. But the following nights only grew stranger. Sometimes, as he drifted off to sleep, he'd hear someone whispering outside his room. The voice was low, murmuring words he couldn't make out. One night, the whispers became louder, like someone chanting something just for him. When he pressed his ear to the door, the voice stopped. Then one evening, Alex found an old journal in the hallway closet, tucked between dusty boxes. Curious, he opened it. The entries dated back nearly 20 years, and as he skimmed the pages, he noticed the entries grew more frantic over time. The final entry read, "He watches at night. I can't breathe, can't move. If anyone finds this, beware, the watcher never leaves." A chill ran down Alex's spine. That night he tried to sleep, but fear kept him awake. Around 3 a.m., the same whispering began, closer than ever, as if right outside his door. Summoning courage, he flung the door open. To his horror, he saw a dark figure crouched in the hallway, its hollow eyes locked onto him. Frozen in place, Alex could only watch as the figure slowly reached out toward him, whispering his name. He backed into his room, slamming the door and locking it, his heart racing. The whispers continued, growing louder, filling his head until he couldn't stand it anymore. By dawn, Alex had packed his things and left the apartment, abandoning everything he owned. He never looked back, but he often heard the whispers in his dreams, calling him back to that haunted place. When I started college, I was assigned to a double room in an older, isolated dorm on campus. My roommate was named Emily, a quiet girl with deep-set eyes and a pale complexion. At first, I figured she was just shy. But as the days passed, it became clear something was off. It began with her strange sleep habits. Every night around 3 a.m., Emily would get out of bed, sit at her desk, and stare blankly at the wall. At first, I thought she was sleepwalking, but her eyes were wide open, completely unblinking, and she muttered something under her breath, like she was reciting a list. The words were unintelligible, a low hum, but the tone was oddly chilling. I tried asking her about it the next morning, but she just looked at me blankly as if she had no idea what I was talking about. Then things got worse. One night, I woke up to see Emily standing at the foot of my bed, her face blank but her eyes focused intensely on me. I gasped, sitting up, and asked her what she was doing. She didn't respond, just turned and walked back to her bed. The next day, I confronted her, but she claimed she had no memory of it. "I sleep really deeply," she said, her voice flat. A few nights later, I came back late from the library and found a journal under her bed. I knew it was wrong to look, but curiosity got the better of me. As I flipped through the pages, I felt my stomach turn. There were pages filled with names, each one crossed out. At the bottom of every page she'd written, "Roommate," with different dates beside it, some scribbled out, others clear. The last entry was recent, and my name was written there too. Panic set in. That night I stayed awake, pretending to sleep. Around 3 a.m. she sat up, her head turning toward me. My heart pounded as she stood up, and I watched her move toward my bed, just as she had in the past. But this time she held something in her hand, a small knife. She whispered my name as she leaned in, her breath cold against my skin. I bolted up, screaming. Startled, she dropped the knife, but her expression remained disturbingly blank. Campus security took her away that night, and I never saw Emily again. I moved to a different dorm and tried to forget, but sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, I feel the weight of her stare, like she's still standing there watching me. I heard later from a student that Emily had a history of mental illness and that I wasn't her first roommate incident. But for me, the memory of her voice whispering my name will haunt me forever.